there's a lot that I had to learn about myself, right? The book was writing me as I was writing the book in a way. The book was teaching me the kind of person I needed to be in order to finish the book. And I think every book does that in its own way. The book says, gosh, in order to exist in the world, I need to kind of mold you as well. And I'm a much different person for having finished my first book. The book invited me to be a more integrated person, right? To say, this is who I am, that you have to understand how people think and what their motivations are and why they might respond to a situation one way as opposed to another way. And that process requires a great deal of empathy. And so, I mean, I suppose maybe it's the kind of recommendation to people to kind of, even if it's not through a book, to kind of the exercise of stepping back and figuring out what has shaped you and how you've been impacted by that is so important.
This is the Business Philosopher Within You podcast. I'm your host, Bhavesh Naik. A foundational theme of this podcast is this idea that when we engage with our work, our team, our business, or our organization with the absolute depth of our humanness, we unlock effortless productivity and performance, which in turn helps us create high-performing, long-lasting organizations that can stand the test of time. However, for this effortless engagement to happen, we need to get in touch with the core of what it means to be a human being, both individually and collectively. To shed some light on the process of such self-exploration, I have invited a very special guest to join us. Tope Folarin is a Nigerian-American writer based in Washington, D.C., who serves as director of the Institute for Policy Studies and the Lennon Visiting Lecturer in Creative Writing at Georgetown University. Among his many awards are the Cain Prize for African Writing, the Whiting Award for Fiction, and a fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts. Tope serves as a board member of the Avalon Theater in Washington, D.C., the vice president of the board of the Penn-Faulkner Foundation, and as a member of the President's Council of Pathfinder. He was educated at Morehouse College and the University of Oxford, where he earned 2 master's degrees as a Rhodes Scholar. His debut novel, A Particular Kind of Black Man, was published by Simon & Schuster. I'm pleased to have you on this podcast, Tope.
So good to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
If you can get us going a little bit, I'm going to start with the book that you wrote.
Yeah.
A Particular Kind of Black Man. If you can do us the honors and read maybe a passage from that book, that would be wonderful.
Of course, I'd love to
hear it in your voice. Okay.
Yeah, so here's my book. This is the hardcover that came out a few years ago. This was, took me some time to write this, and it really was a passion project. I was doing this in the middle of doing a bunch of other things in my life. I've always had a full-time day job. And then, the kids came along as well. So, I'm sort of finishing up my second novel. So it's really a pleasure to go back and read the first one.
Yes. By the way, I am going through your book. I'm 10%
okay, good.
And for our listeners, it's a tremendous piece of work. And I can't stop turning the pages. I'm also a busy guy, just like Tope. But every time I read it, I want to know what's happening next. So I'm engaged and I'm reading it, and it's good that I haven't finished it because I don't want to be warning people about the the spoilers and things like that. So
of course. All right.
I'll
just read a few paragraphs. Right. Okay. Start from the beginning. She told me I could serve her in heaven. She accompanied me to school each day. School was about a mile away, and a few hundred feet into my trek, just as my family's apartment building drifted out of view behind me, she would appear at my side. I don't remember how she looked. Memory often summons a generic figure in her place, an elderly white woman with frizzled gray hair, slightly bent over, a smile featuring an assortment of gaps and silver linings. I do remember her touch, however. It felt cool and papery, disarmingly comfortable on the hottest days of fall. She would often pat my head as we walked together, and a penetrating silence would cancel the morning sounds around us. I felt comfortable, protected somehow in her presence. She never walked all the way to school with me, but her parting words were always the same. Remember, if you are a good boy here on earth, you can serve me in heaven. I was 5 years old. Her words sounded magical to me, vast and alluring. I didn't know her. I barely knew her name, but the offer she held out to me each morning seemed far too generous to dismiss lightly. In class, I would think about what servitude in heaven would be like. I'd thought of water for her on streets of gold, rubbing her feet as angels sang praises in the background. I imagined that I'd have my own heavenly shack. I'd have time to do my own personal heavenly things as well. How else would I get to heaven? One day I told my father about her offer. We were talking about heaven, a favorite subject of his, and I mentioned that I already had a place there. I've already found someone to serve, I said. What do you mean? Dad smiled warmly at me. I felt his love. I repeated myself. Daddy, I'm going to heaven. And how are you going to get there? I told him about the old lady, my heavenly shack, the streets of gold. My father stared at me a moment, grief and sadness surging briefly to the surface of his face, and then anger. He leaned forward, stared into my eyes. Listen to me now. The only person you will serve in heaven is God. You will serve no one else.
Wow. So this is happening somewhere in Utah.
Yeah, so this is based on my life, and this is happening in, I guess, Bountiful, Utah, which is where I went to school.
Okay.
And had an opportunity, and you know, it's kind of echoes my experience as well. My parents are from Nigeria, and arrived in the States in the late 70s. And my dad thought, you know, he, like many people around the world, watched a bit of television, and had this idea of America that didn't align with the America that he arrived in. You know, he came to America to be educated. And ended up in Utah of all places, and it was, I think, difficult for him and difficult for his children, me and my siblings.
Now, Tunde is the character in the book. So your book, backing up a little bit, is a fiction. But I read somewhere, and correct me if I'm wrong, you started writing out a biography or autobiography, but somehow changed it to a fiction. Was there a moment when that switch happened for you, or was it more like a process of, you were writing the book and you thought, hey, this might be a better fiction than an autobiographical account?
Yeah, you know, what happened was I had this deep desire to write, and I didn't know what I wanted to write. And I also had all these stories from my childhood kind of bouncing around in my head. And so I figured as a kind of placeholder, I would write about my own childhood. And so I started writing, and it's funny, my book starts in a kind of like an explicitly autobiographical place.
Right.
And I was writing about the things that I experienced and my parents experienced. But then as I continued to write, the strangest thing happened. I didn't go to school for writing, and many writers talk about this moment when the characters come alive for them.
Yes.
And the characters start telling them what they want to do. And I dismissed that out of hand initially. I thought that's a bunch of nonsense. I need like actual tips for writing a book, and not like sort of mumbo jumbo about how characters talk to you. The funniest thing happened, which is that the character who initially had my name started doing things and sort of responding to events that had happened in my life in a way that I would not have responded to those events. And I felt this other presence. Again, now I'm talking using the mumbo jumbo, but I felt this other presence as I wrote, like this kind of character that had his own ambitions. And so I think that's when I realized that I was actually writing a novel. And that it freed me to kind of, as it were, step away from my story. Because initially as I wrote, I thought, well, I have to kind of try to the extent that I can to kind of adhere to the story of my life. But once I determined that Tope was actually Tunde, it kind of opened up the vistas of what I could write about. And I recognized that I was actually writing a work of fiction.
The muse shows up, as they say.
Exactly. It's a real thing.
It's a real thing.
It's a
It's
real thing.
unbelievable. I'm
Yeah, it's
writing a
incredible.
book, and that's happening to me as well. So
Yeah,
as you explain, it's a freeing experience, and the words just kind of flow out, and you kind of get into this
yeah,
zone. It's like, you're riding in the stream of consciousness, and the words are just pouring out, and it's a beautiful place
yeah,
to be. It's
yeah.
great. So how much of Tope is Tunde, and how much of Tunde is Tope? Tunde, by the way, for our listeners, is the character in the book, obviously, and we are talking to Tope. So what are the similarities and differences between these two characters?
Yeah.
On you don't have to give
Oh,
away
I
the
know.
plot or anything like that. Just kind of on a high level.
No, it's I think Tunde has a fair bit of me. Like
Yeah.
I gave Tunde my sort of a lot of my childhood story.
Right.
I think Tunde this is a story about how somebody tries to construct their identity.
Sure.
Just like me, Tunde's parents are from Nigeria,
Right.
and he's born and raised in America.
Sure.
And so he's American by birth, but his parents claim that he's a Nigerian because they're from Nigeria.
Sure.
That doesn't quite sort of work for him. He also wonders, but he doesn't kind of emerge from an African-American cultural tradition.
Sure.
And there aren't many African-Americans around. So he's trying to figure out who he is
Right.
in the midst of, all of these kind of competing identities. And that's from me as well. I would say that Tunde is a little kind of more unsettled about his identity sort of journey than I was.
Sure.
And I would also say that he is, I think by the time I got to college, I was on the pathway to kind of figuring out who I was.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure the same can be said for Tunde. And I think Tunde is also he's in certain ways a kind of ramped up version of me. I think his head is in the clouds a lot more than mine was, but who's to say? I don't know.
Right.
I can't recall every single day of my childhood. But we are different people. And that's the fascinating thing about this process. And maybe even more important than that is that he's had different experiences than I had. There are things that happen in the book that did not happen to me.
Sure.
And those experiences shaped him in a way that may make him even more different from me. So,
Sure.
Again, it's a mystical, again, we're using these words.
Mm-hmm.
I think when you sit down to write a book, that the best thing that can happen is kind of losing control of the process. And I know that might sound counterintuitive.
Yeah.
But that's when you're allowing this kind of other thing. I don't know how we'll name it. We can call it the muse or this other presence. That's when you're allowing it to take over it. You're kind of describing the flow state. And that's what I encourage my students. I encourage my students all the time to kind of do everything they can to allow that to happen to them as they write, because there are all kinds of things that can descend on you. This kind of feeling of insecurity, or I don't know what to write about, or I'm not writing this thing the way that I envision it in my head. It's more rough on the page. And the thing I constantly tell my students is just do it, not to kind of, but just write as much as you can. Yeah. The goal when you sit down with your pad or your laptop or whatever is to just let your fingers move of their own accord. You can always go back and revise. Yeah. But you need something to revise. You need sand before you can build a sandcastle. So your job when you're starting to write is to just kind of create as much sand as possible. So you can shape it later. And when you're in that state, when you're just you're not being sort of strict on yourself, or you're not rehearsing all the various things you don't like about your writing, but you're just writing, that's when the magic happens.
I was listening to Alex Haley's interview on PBS the other day, and he was describing something very, very similar. He was writing, Alex Haley is the writer of Roots, which turned out to be one of the best sellers, and so an extraordinary piece of work, which ended up becoming a TV serial later on, which was also a huge hit. And this is about 70s, I'm assuming. And he was talking about this chapter where the Kunta Kinte, the character, the main character of this story, is being taken as a slave from the coast of Africa. So he gets on a ship. So he's taken on a ship to America. And he wrote a chapter about this journey. And he said it was about 35 to 50 pages long. And he says, I wrote this 3 or 4 times and chucked it. It's just not. It's this process that you're explaining that it's not the muse that's writing it. There is something wrong with it. He's not happy with it. So he actually went to Africa. He got on a ship, similar to what he's describing. And he says, I stripped down from my underwear every night. And I would go down into the bunkers where he would have slept. Kunta Kinte would have slept. And he would sleep on this long table, just like a dining table, basically. And he does this for 3, 4, 5 nights. And he says, this is not doing it. No matter what I do, this is still 5-star luxury compared to the experience that I'm trying to describe. So he basically says, one day I went to the stern of the ship. I'm standing at the railing, and then he is experiencing his own life story. He was a struggling writer before he became a big success. So he's thinking, okay, if I just jumped off the railing, this can all end. And wouldn't that be so wonderful? Wouldn't that be so great?
Yeah.
And all these characters showed up, including Kunta Kinte. And they said, don't do it. And here's how you write the story. And the story in the chapter came alive. So the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I guess my question to you is, Muse shows up eventually, and that's what we strive for. But he or she or it, whatever that element is, it doesn't show up that easily. Is that your experience, or is there some struggle to get to this place of being in the flow, where the quote unquote you said losing control, and the story writes itself?
Yeah, there's all kinds of barriers to that constantly.
Yeah.
I mean, I think part of it is trying to figure out the story you want to write and why this is an important story, why this story needs to exist in the world. I mean, like there's all of that stuff in the back of your head.
Sure.
You might, and this is often what happens, especially when you're writing fiction,
right?
Is you might have a particular story in mind, and as you write, it starts to go off in a different direction.
Sure.
And that can be scary because you might have planned, like, this is what I want to do, and I don't know what happens if I go off in this different direction.
Right.
And then and writing a book can also, so many things that have to work in a book. There's the plot.
Sure.
And then the writing itself has to be sort of captivating. You have to figure out what your voice is.
Yeah.
That's the other thing that I sort of emphasize. Whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, what is your literary voice? Which is to say, what is your identity on the page? It does take some time. It's to kind of figure that out. And you might sort of stumble sometimes in trying to reach, and like any other profession, there's always a moment of apprenticeship where you're kind of basically modeling stuff that you admire. Writers go through this process as well. They're like, oh, I really like this book. And they find themselves writing in the style of the author they admire. Absolutely. And like one of my favorite activities is to go to the museum. I love visual arts, and going through the museum in the middle of like a workday.
Right.
And inevitably you'll see like the student like sitting in front of a painting and doing sketching into a book. And they're learning how to paint or to draw by looking at something that a master has produced, and writers do the same. So, I mean, like you have to figure out what your voice is. You have to figure out what the story is. And sometimes you write yourself into, sort of into something of a maze, and it's hard to escape. You're like, how do I get to the other side? Right. The thing to keep in mind throughout all, and this is the thing that all writers experience. So sometimes even in that flow state, you might kind of just go off and do something that just doesn't serve the larger work.
Right.
But you have to maintain a sort of sense of calm, and a sense as well that all of this will lead to the destination.
Sure.
There is something that's distinctly spiritual about writing, right? Like it's this idea, like it's about having faith in a way. It's like, I'm lost in the woods, but I will make my way through. It'll figure itself out. Because I think if you lose that sense of calm and security, um, then it becomes much harder.
Sure.
You have to accept the process.
Yeah.
And I think there's something about life there as well. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know quite where I am or quite how I'm going to get where I want to go, but this process is important. This process will yield things that I can't even see right now.
Yeah.
And I'm a much different person for having finished my first book. You know, like I wish I could go back sometimes and have a conversation with the younger version of me who started this,
Correct.
because he had all kinds of ideas about how the process would go.
Right.
And I went through this journey, and I'm so relieved and gratified that I'm on the other side.
Yes.
But there's a lot that I had to learn about myself.
Right.
The book was writing me as I was writing the book.
Yes.
The book was teaching me the kind of person I needed to be in order to finish the book.
Right.
And I think every book does that in its own way. The book says, gosh, in order to exist in the world, I need to kind of mold you as well.
Right.
Because you need to have a certain kind of thoughts and a certain kind of way of viewing the world in order to bring me into being.
Absolutely.
And so I think submitting to that as well is a key part of finishing a project.
Yeah. Allowing the book to write itself through you in a way.
Yeah.
And you said some beautiful things there, you know, that am I the person that I need to be to write this book? Actually, you don't even ask that question. You just let it happen, because the book itself, the character itself is going to mold you to becoming that person who you need to be and that's the process. I suppose that's probably where the quote unquote struggle is for the rational, logical mind to kind of have to grapple with that. You know, you trying to hold on to this, you know, trying to control the process. But
it reminds me of. I was just going to say very quickly that one of my favorite, I love, among the shows that I kind of return to every now and then, is a show called The West Wing.
Yeah.
And I can't remember what episode it was, but I remember an image of the president character is named President Jed Bartlett. Right. He's played by Martin Sheen. Sure. And there's a moment right before President Bartlett is about to deliver a speech. If memory serves, I haven't seen this episode in a few years, but this is what I recall of it. He's a little flustered. He doesn't quite know, he's like concerned about various things. And he's in his head, and his wife goes up to him and cuts his tie. And he's insane. It's like, what are you doing? And he kind of scrambles. He throws the tie off. Somebody shows him another tie, and that gets him out of his head. And he goes out on the stage and delivers an incredible speech. And I bring that up because, like, that moment, that intervention, kind of shook him up a little bit, enabled him to execute the way he needed to execute. And I had a similar experience. At least I think of it as a similar experience, which is my editor at Simon & Schuster. Once he acquired the book, told me to cut out the middle, like 40 pages of it. Right. These are pages that I'd spent years of my life writing. And when he returned the manuscript to me, he like X'd out, and he's like, this has to go. You need something else to to kind of fill in that gap. And I was incensed with him, and it took me another year to figure that out. And I just saw all my friends getting published, and I'm like, this is crazy. Like, what is this? The book was fine. And one day I was taking a shower, and this like incredible new idea dropped into my head, and I wrote that out, and I sent it to him, and he said, now the book is done. And so I think in a way, like, he made the book better by ripping out something that I thought was essential, and something that perhaps, because I'd labored over it for such a long time, wasn't getting the book where it needed to be. So again, I think there's so many parts of the process that are essential, and that's why, like, I try to submit to the process. You know, like, I don't know who, like, you never know who's going to edit the book, what publishing house will do, however the book gets out there. But if you trust that the book will kind of summon the people it needs to get into the world, then you just kind of say, it's fine. And I do the part that I can do, which is like write and focus on craft and make sure that I can execute the ideas I have, and then let this process move forward.
Another aspect of it, I think you kind of touched on this a little bit. One of the things that Alex Haley talks about is the fact that, he struggled with trying to be Kunta Kinte himself, but he gave up because he's thinking, I don't have the life experience. I'm not worthy enough to write this story. If that was his struggle, right? How can I write about this character when I'm not him, I can never be him. I'm not going to have that experience that he is going through, and I'm trying to write about him. So he tries to do this Africa thing, still doesn't work. So, and when Kunta Kinte shows up and says, "This is how you write." So the idea there, I think that was my takeaway, and I want to ask you for your take, is that you don't have to be the other person. You just have to be into your own experience. Does that make sense? So so this idea of being relatable. So if I'm writing a story that is so deeply personal, right? Would this other person who is the reader, would that person be able to engage and connect with that story? And is that a conscious effort, or is that, you just, once again, you just let the characters tell the story and the process unfold? Any takes on that?
Yeah.
How do you deal with this idea of relatability?
Yeah. It's a really important question. And I think one that as a culture, we're still grappling with, because all of us grew up like looking at stories and reading stories and hearing stories. In the midst of all of that, there are, I think, assumptions about the stories that are supposedly universal and the kinds of stories that are not. I mean, even that word itself, man, is freighted, it's fraught, I should say, and perhaps, sort of with all kinds of meanings. And
meaning the word relatable?
Yeah, universal, exactly. Yeah,
it's a universal. Okay, the word universal.
Yeah, right. But similar kinds of words, right? Like that are getting at the same thing. It's this assumption that there are certain humans that are having experiences that other humans can understand, and then there are humans who are having experiences that a smaller number of humans can comprehend. And I reject that out of hand. I think that we are all humans who are having experiences, and a human, I might be, say, a human somewhere in the Congo who is living in a completely different scenario, but I'm still a human being who has emotions and has desires and ambitions and faults and vices and things I do really well. And I think the story is about how a human being who's put in a situation kind of responds to that situation.
You're right.
And so I think, in my view, that every story is universal. And I think the key that we have is about sort of valuing certain experiences in certain contexts more than we do others. And I think it's critical, especially in the century. I think that we need to kind of move beyond that sort of conception of the kinds of stories that need to be out there. Because I think what happens is that if we do have this very limited edition of universal, then we'll continue to kind of see the same stories in the marketplace, the same kinds of movies, the same kinds of books, the same kinds of other kinds of experiences. And so it's critically important for us as humans to learn more about the human experience, to learn about how humans in contexts that we don't understand or get are responding to those contexts, because that'll tell us more about how human beings can kind of surmount the challenges that we all face together. I mean, this is the last thing I'll say. We're facing a series of challenges that aren't limited to like the nation state, that aren't limited to particular world. They impact all of us. There's a range of these, whether it's climate change is, at the top of the list, or, migration patterns that are impacted by climate change. And so now is a moment when we need to kind of understand more about the human experience in all of its forms. And I think there's one pathway to kind of getting our arms around that.
Yes, thank you. So I think that makes a lot of sense, that you can, what happens to some of the movies, so it becomes formulaic, the trying to become universal. Your writing can become formulaic or templated in some way, right? So, and yet I would say that the depth of our human experience is actually at one level kind of universal, if you think about it.
Yeah.
Now, right? So that now, funny thing that, and I'm debating whether or not to go here, but I think we just opened a can of worms. You you watch a kid, 5-year-old, right?
Yeah.
And we have these talent shows today, and
Oh,
you
yeah.
all seen a kid, 5-year-old, singing like he's an 80-year-old who has lived
Sure.
this life of depth.
Yeah.
And all the emotions are there. He would be,
Yeah.
or she would be singing about, love and loss and grief. All of that stuff is coming out in the singing. So I would argue, which is that I think we have access through our art. And I think this is what art does. Yeah, all forms of art, writing music, or singing, all forms of art, sculptures and paintings. It is that we are connected at a deeper level from this way in, not the way out. And we bring that connection into our work of art, and we express that. And that's how it becomes relatable, because I am actually talking about what everybody else is feeling and experiencing anyway. So there is a common denominator of the human experience that we all have access to. We may not be living it day to day. I may be I'm a trust fund baby who has never had to struggle in his life. But I could, even as a trust fund baby, I can pick up a book or watch a show that is poignant and can connect with that and cry tears of either joy or grief or what have you, and have that experience that is being portrayed to me.
Yeah, I'm glad you went there.
Agree, disagree with that?
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I mean, I think we're spirits having human experiences, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that, to use your example, like the trust fund baby or the homeless person, I think that there's so much that connects these two people. And sometimes what art does is it reminds you of your own humanity, and it brings you out of your context as well. It says, okay, here's where you're situated, but here are other people who are humans, who are kind of beset with, they're kind of mired in different circumstances, and here's what they're doing to navigate that. And it's the reason why, the practice of, whether we're talking about reading, reviewing art, or whatever else, is a critical part of the human experience, because these serve as reminders of who we are, and they give us sort of tips about how to navigate life. I mean, at least that's what art is about. And I think, to go back to an early part of this conversation, if you're constantly kind of watching the same kind of movie featuring the same kind of characters, or reading the same kind of book with the same kind of sort of scenarios, then you're depriving yourself of a kind of full range of ideas and experiences. Like, I think we all, or many of us anyway, had the librarian who said that if you want to live like multiple lives, like, just spend your time in the library reading. And there's so much to that. And you can derive ideas and beliefs and all kinds of things from the experience of reading. I mean, one of the most important parts of my childhood was the fact that I did spend so much time in the library reading so much. And I learned, one, that the feelings that I had I was not the first person in the history of the world to feel this way about certain things, that there were other humans who had experienced these feelings and had arrived at certain conclusions. And it reminded me more than anything else that we're all in so many ways just similar. And it might be, and this applies to politics as well. You have somebody, you might be like, disagree profoundly with someone politically, but if you pull back the layers of their experience, you'll find someone who's just like you, who's probably responding to a different set of stimuli, right? In the way that perhaps you would if you were. And so the process of understanding has to start there. It has to start like, even this person with whom I disagree profoundly on a number of issues is a fellow human being who might have arrived at this conclusion based on circumstances beyond their control. I think if you approach a situation like that, it becomes easier to have a conversation with that person as well, and attempt to sort of surmount those difficulties, and perhaps even arrive at a place where you understand each other more than you did at the outset.
Switching the gears a little bit, Tope, we talked about not following the patterns, and yet there are some formula for writing, such as, for example, there is conflict and resolution. There's before-after transformation. There is a video of Kurt Vonnegut going around where he is explaining the arc of the character, and I think he's talking about Cinderella story. And my favorite is the hero's journey, where you the comfort zone.
Joseph Campbell.
Joseph Campbell, yes. And you called on an invitation, you denied the invitation, you go for it anyway, all of those things. So what is the role of these kinds of aids, I would say, that kind of help us on our writing journey? And I think that, I don't think this is just a beginner's question. I think even the advanced writers will also follow some of these formulaic patterns of writing and some of the archetypes types of things.
Yeah.
And you take some.
I think they're all incredibly important. And I don't begrudge anybody who wants to read Campbell and follow the templates that he has he's presenting to his readers. I think that all of those ideas are incredibly important. I mean, part of what Joseph Campbell did is spend a part of his life reading all of these sort of human stories, these myths, and finding out that there were certain elements that connected these stories. And and part of what he's saying is that you can be a human who is living in what we now call North America, or a human who's living in Southern Africa, or an indigenous person in what we now call Australia. And in many ways, you're telling the same story. And there's something that's incredibly impactful about that. How is that the case that we're all telling similar stories and we've never met each other, right? That's right. There's something powerful about that. It says that there's something at our core. And again, it goes back to something you said before about how we're all connected. And Carl Jung, Campbell was influenced by Jung, who had these ideas about the collective unconscious, and Campbell drew on that when he developed his ideas about storytelling. So I think that we do require these stories, because these stories are trying to tell us something, again, about the human experience that perhaps you wouldn't know otherwise. And so those stories are important. I think in my own writing journey, I spent a lot of time reading Joseph Campbell, and I spent a lot of time reading Jung as well. And I learned a lot from these people, those writers and other people, about sort of the kind of templates that one can use, and the kind of really sort of ancient stories that connect us as well, that are important. And I think learning about those stories is important. And if you decide that you want to write a story that relies on those ideas, and that's good as well. I mean, part of it is learning how to execute that. To take a less sort of weighty example, a lot of people will enjoy a good romantic comedy, right? And they know the difference between a good romantic comedy and one that doesn't work as well. And part of it is, how good are the artists in question at executing the formula?
Sure.
And if you're really good at executing the formula, when somebody watches it, they will, despite themselves, have pleasure in watching it, partly because they're anticipating the beats, the kind of meet cute, where these two characters meet each other, the inevitable breakup. We know they're going to break up at some point, and the sadness and the anger, and then their journey from breakup to reconnecting by the end of the movie. And we know how the story goes, but we want to see how a new artist kind of sort of execution of that. And we love that. Or a thriller. The thrillers have formulas. Mysteries in general have formulas. So we as humans love genre, and genre is nothing but, a template. And we go into these genres knowing how the stories will unfold, and we still love them anyway. So there's something to be said for that kind of storytelling that's great. And that applies too to literary fiction or the nonfiction books. There's all kinds of tropes about, that we see in nonfiction as well, that people are constantly playing with. So I think that that's great and that's fine.
Sure.
There are some people who like want to play the classics, and then there's some people who want to play, jazz, and they want to improvise. But even, the best jazz players have a deep understanding of music theory, which is, I suppose, the musical equivalent of like, they have a deep understanding of melody, which are the musical equivalents of like, sort of the basic storytelling units that we've been talking about. So you have to understand, even if you want to go off in a different direction, what those before you have done. You have to understand how those stories work and why they work. Why does the thriller, why does the mystery, still work? The same basic template has been working for centuries. Why is that the case? What is it about this kind of story form that inspires humans all over the place, that gratifies them, that edifies them? If you begin to understand that, you can take those principles into the work that you're doing as a storyteller.
Absolutely. One of the reasons why some of these templates appeal to us is because the good ones actually mimic, or in that going to that relatability thing, it mimics the actual experience. Now, you are a great example because you started writing, you started out writing in nonfiction, and it ended up becoming a fiction.
Mm-hmm.
So even in a nonfiction exploration of who you are and your arc as a character, Tope, there are certain elements of it that are universal, such as you start. There are some differences. In your case, you're 5 years old, so you're starting out. But normally, if you have a 30-year-old, then they have some life experience, and then they are in a sort of comfort zone. But even for a 5-year-old, that's true. You're in a comfort zone. Things are going great.
Yeah.
But things are not as great as you think they are, right?
Yeah.
From the outside. And there are some, by the way, in your book, so there are some, you demonstrate that in such a beautiful way, where Tunde and the relationship between him and his mother.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I don't want to ruin the surprises here, but there is some pretty poignant stuff there. And he's in that situation, and for our audience, you can think about Harry Potter. He's living in his uncle's cupboard.
Yeah.
And these are horrible people who are treating him really badly.
Yeah.
And the invitation comes and said that says there's better things out there for you. And he says, no, I'm good. I'm fine. I'm okay. The owl comes and delivers a little postcard, and he ignores it. So the invitation comes, you're in a comfort zone, and we cling to our comfort zone. That's part of, and I think that's also a coping mechanism. That is a survival mechanism, that we accept where we are, but then there is some invitation, some idea of there is better for you than this. So that's part of the journey, and then we go on that journey. We don't want to be on that journey, but then we go on that journey. So in Harry Potter, there's an external journey, but there's also an internal journey of self-exploration. Who I really am, what are my magical powers? More literal in his case, but then for us, it's like I'm powerful and I have my own source of power, and then we go exploring that deeper and deeper and deeper, and that's the journey. I see it as like journey of self-exploration, going deeper and deeper and finding our own power. So that is pretty inspiring, and it's also pretty relevant. And it can be relevant in a mundane way.
Absolutely.
I have a leaky roof.
Yeah.
And some guy knocks on the door and says, hey, I can fix that leaky roof. And he said, oh, no, that's okay. I'm fine. Because I don't want to talk to a salesman right now. We're good. Right? So the invitation comes and we deny it. We push it away, and we don't want to go on that journey right now. So any thoughts on what we can do in terms of exploring these elements, as in the comfort zone, but then the exploration of who we are? I think you've done that in your book quite a bit, but you've done it more from the child's perspective, at least in the beginning, the part that I've read. and I don't know where I'm going with this. I don't know if you have any take on what that process of self exploration is like, and I think you kind of alluded to this in the beginning, where you said, "I'm
Yeah,
glad I did this. I'm a better
yeah,
person because of this. And if I hadn't done this, I would have basically missed. I would have missed out something huge on
yeah,
this journey that I went on, me, Tope.
yeah,
That I'm glad that I did."
yeah. I think the great thing about writing is that even if you're not writing something that's autobiographical,
Right.
that you're having to deep dive into, um, like emotions and feelings and how people respond to certain situations.
Right.
One question that you constantly have to ask yourself as a writer is if you put two characters in a room and they're having an argument or something,
Right.
um, you have to understand both sides. Like, why is this person upset? Why is this other person upset? Why
Right.
is there conflict here? What's going on? And you have to understand that it's interesting in a way that will feel authentic to the reader, because
Right.
readers are incredibly adept at saying, no, that doesn't feel right. That doesn't sound right.
Right.
That's not quite right.
Yeah.
And so the question is, what is right, and how do you get there? And
Yes.
that's the question that the writer constantly has to think about. With, for example, my students, we have weekly workshops where we will read each other's work. They will read each other's work, and they'll comment on what's working for them and what isn't working for them. And the reason why they can do that, even though they're just kind of starting their journeys as writers, is because of the fact that we've all seen, again, and read so many stories. There's so much, it's called content these days, and I'm not sure I agree with that, because I think it kind of doesn't maybe capture the effort that artists have put into creating it, but that they've all seen and heard and read so much, and so they can feel instinctually like that feels right or that doesn't feel right. And that's a really interesting kind of approach, because it's funny. It's sometimes something can happen in real life,
Right.
and it doesn't work in a story, right?
Right.
Somebody will say that doesn't, and you can say, and this happens all the time when I'm reading their work. They'll say, no, this actually happened to me, and you can say, well, that did happen to you, but that doesn't work in this context. So
Right.
there's a couple of things happening here. One is, that writers and other artists need to kind of to observe what's going on. Like, one thing that I recommend, aspiring writers to do is just like sit in a park and eavesdrop on conversations, hear how people talk to each other, and how the dialogue works, or hear what somebody's saying on the phone as they walk by, their tone of voice, all that stuff is essential, and that will filter into the work in its own way. The second part, though, realizing that fiction or storytelling in general kind of happens in this heightened place where, that
Right.
we don't speak perfectly. You'll watch a show and they're just kind of back and forth, and they're witty, and they always have the perfect thing to say. And the moment they stop
Right.
having the conversation, the phone will ring. The phone's not often interrupting for,
Right.
there's so much about it that's constructed.
Yeah.
And to keep that in mind too, as you're writing, that that the reader or the viewer is also coming for a heightened experience, a heightened version of life.
Sure.
And so
Right.
the writer or the creator has to keep both of those things in mind at the same time, that I need to deliver an experience that feels real, that feels true to life, but I also need to deliver experience that is by definition not true to life, that is also in its own way fictional, right? And so I think
Right.
this is something that sometimes that can be difficult for folks who are just starting out. They think if I just put reality on a page and that's it. And no, you have to, and part of it is what you were saying before. It's about the templates, the kind of story, the kind of ancient stories that
Right.
are so that direct so much of our lives, that inform us how to be human and how to interact with each other. That that we still have this expectation that the stories we tell will in some ways conform to those ideas about how to transmit our human experience to other human beings.
So it's I think I was reading Stephen King's. He wrote a book called On Writing.
Yeah.
He said it was the hardest book he ever wrote. It was
Yeah.
a short book.
Yeah.
He's a guy who's written 500-page books, and he's saying one of the things that one of the things it recommends is that you read a lot and you write a lot. Basically, just
Yeah, it's the best advice.
read a yeah, right. And one of the things he said there is that don't come to this lightly. This is, and I don't know if he was just trying to kind of give a challenge or something like that. He says, this is hard.
Yeah.
Writing is hard. And so I guess that's a sort of a challenge for a guy like me. If someone says that to me, don't come to this lightly. It's like a challenge. Okay, all right. If you give me that challenge, I'm gonna attempt writing. So it's like basically that takeaway, the reverse psychology type of thing. I think, but I think he also means it. I think it's hard.
Yeah.
In the sense, but then I think something that you said is that you can't edit what you haven't written.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So, on that note, do you have a routine, some kind of a discipline that you've developed? And this is a question that I have them myself, and I'm sure that a lot of other writers, aspiring writers, and we're gonna go to the business folks in a minute. People who are just writing biographical things, for other reasons than publishing a book. But is there a discipline, some kind of a process that you have that you follow that you think that we can learn from?
Yeah, I try to do everything I can to be in a receptive place when I write. So I don't want to, because like anybody else, there's voices in my head and there's,
Right.
other things that require my attention.
Sure.
And so what I've done for years is, I will come back from work and I have 2 small kids. I'll get them to bed. And then I'll try, hang out with my partner and we'll watch something on television. And I'll generally try to watch something that is not serious, that is frivolous, because I need like a transition moment from whatever serious stuff I was dealing with during the day. And then of course, like with the kids, to this space, this zone of like freedom and of permission to like play with my imagination and everything else. And so for me, that transition is like watching something dumb on television and laughing and kind of like releasing all the stuff. And then generally I will write from 10 p.m. to 1 a.m. every night. So I think part of it is like figuring out when you are most open. Like a lot of people most open in the morning, like when they wake up. And, a lot of writers will say like, gosh, that's the place, that's the moment in the day when I am at my freest and I give myself the most permission to do the kinds of things that I need to do in order to be a good artist. Others are like, like me, definitely like a night owl. And so, when it's dark outside and when everyone is asleep, for whatever reason, that has always been for me the best time to produce work. And so I must say though that the past couple of years that's been interrupted by a random kid waking up and wanting but
so is there a number of words that you shoot for when you write?
Yeah, it depends on the project I'm working on. If I'm writing, sometimes at night I also write a lot of literary criticism. So if I'm working on a piece for a magazine, say, it's important for me to say, like if it's a 2,500 word piece, I'll say to myself, I'm going to write 300 words a night, because that enables me, because I know that, after, a week and a couple days, like I have written 2,500 words. And so that's something that's achievable. And because sometimes if you're writing a piece for a magazine, you think, I don't know if I have, I don't know what I'm going to write about. So like that gets past the kind of mental barrier of doing that. If I'm working on like fiction, like a novel, I will definitely, especially because like many busy people, I have these discrete moments when I can write. So obviously the one time is at night. And so I try to write as much as I can there. Another thing that I do is that if I'm in the middle of a project, I will go to a hotel in town. I live in DC, so I'll go to a hotel somewhere else in DC, like not that far away. And for me, has been incredibly important, because I'm away from my life, but I'm still very accessible with 2 kids. So if my wife says, you need to come back now, like this kid is acting, crazy, I can jump on the metro and I'm back home in like 10 minutes. But if I'm away for like a couple of days writing, like I will definitely say to myself, by the time I leave, I need to produce like 5,000 words. And that is much easier in that space.
Sure.
I will close the doors, I'll pull down the blinds, I'll disconnect from the internet, and I'll just write all day long. And that's probably when I'm at my most productive. So I do think that having a word count in mind is important, because it also, at least for me, and I think for others as well, it can say that just hitting that number is important. Not, ensuring that every word is perfect, or not trying to sort of perfectly execute, whatever it is you have in your mind, but just getting the words on the page. Because that's the most critical part of it. Like, just get some words on the page, and words, to return to a theme that we've revisited a few times in this conversation. Get the words on the page so you can do something with them.
Sure.
And having in mind like a word count is one way of getting there.
And you mentioned that towards the beginning of the show, that somewhere in the middle, actually, I think you said that, I'm glad that I did this, and I wouldn't be the person that I am if I hadn't written this book. And I think you've written some short stories. You also teach at Georgetown. So you have tremendous amount of experience, not just writing, but also teach other people how to write, right? So with all of that in mind, you've grown as a person. Now, has there been any benefits or advantages or something that you grew in terms of your leadership capacity? You are director of IPS, and I'm sure that you have a staff, you have people you interact with, there are stakeholders that I'm sure there are. I don't know if you get involved in fundraising and things like that, but the people that you interact with, and you are showing up, how has that changed because of this exercise of writing, having written a book, of this kind of an inner exploration?
The one thing I've learned is, when I started my career, I knew that I wanted to be a great artist, and I was also definitely interested in sort of policy and politics. And I assumed that I would have to do them on separate tracks, right? That I'd have to apportion my day, during these hours I'm doing this stuff, and then these hours I'm doing this other thing. And the thing I've learned, especially with writing the book, is that everything is connected. It doesn't make sense for me to say, from the hours of 9 to 5, I am thinking about policy and HR issues and fundraising and the rest of it.
Right.
And then, from the hours of 10 to 1 to say, to use some times that I offered before, I'm just doing this writing thing.
Sure.
I'm at my best when, during the day, if an idea comes to me, like in the middle of a meeting, if I can, I'll step away and I'll attend to that idea. This idea, it might not come again. Let me get this down.
Yeah.
And part of the reason why that happens is because my mind isn't sort of focused on it.
Sure.
Like, it's one of those things. That's why the shower is such an incredible place for so many people. Is your mind is like kind of wandering, and the idea drops in because you're not like sort of obsessing over it.
Sure.
And also at night when I'm thinking about like my art, I'm trying to write. Ideas about the day will often sort of filter in. So I think that writing the book, because I wrote the book as I was, I had another job. I was working for a financial regulatory organization.
Yeah.
And I wrote a lot of the book at night, when I wasn't at work. But I also I would occasionally start writing it during the day, if I had a lunch break, or sometimes in the middle of a meeting. And I think the book invited me to be a more integrated person.
There you go. Yes.
Right? To say, this is who I am.
Exactly.
I am somebody who cares about policy. I'm somebody who cares about politics. I'm somebody who cares about culture.
Yeah.
I'm also an artist. And these aren't separate things. This is part of who I am.
Yeah.
And so I no longer think about my life and my days in those kind of segregated terms.
Absolutely.
I let them all kind of mix up together.
Sure. I think there's a Gandhi quote It goes something like, life is an indivisible whole. You can't separate them in his family and business and art pursuits and weekend hobbies. It's just one thing. And so, and you said integrated. It made me an integrated person. One of the things that the title of the podcast is The Business Philosopher Within You. And the business philosopher, when I define the business philosopher in three terms, one is a philosopher is someone who thinks, basically. Someone who does authentic, original thinking. It may be, it may be thoughts that other people have thought about. That doesn't matter. But to you, it's an original thought. So we do our own thinking. That's number one. Number two, what do we think about? We think about human condition. I mean, that's my definition, right? A philosopher thinks, and he or she thinks about human condition. And the business aspect of that is that the business philosopher basically takes this thinking and this feeling and brings it into a marketable entity that can stand the test of the marketplace. Profit and loss and balance sheet and revenues and market share, all of these things. So they make this philosophy, the philosophical aspects of what they've discovered practical, and they reach out to people, they fix their problems, they bring them solutions, those kinds of things. I think that, and this is my perspective, and I'm glad I'm talking to you because I want to get your perspective on this, is that being able to think and being able to feel are very important aspects of being able to lead an organization.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Barack Obama, when he was running for president, he wrote a book. And it was a very introspective book called The Dreams of My Father, right? Yeah. And it made him, it became a part of his campaigning message. That's a political thing. But it made him a better leader because he owned his own story. And then that added to his presence, his charisma, but how he shows up. So I get the feeling that that's happened in your case as well. I want to confirm that with you and see if that's true.
Yeah, I think that's a really resonant example. I mean, I think Obama wrote that book before he became a politician, I think. And that's really fascinating. He was, biracial. His father's from Kenya, his mom's from America. He spent some time growing up in Indonesia, also spent time, I suppose, in Hawaii. So here's a guy who's kind of all over the place. And the book enabled him to kind of figure out how those ostensibly disparate parts of his biography were connected. And so I think that when I was writing my book, that I was also kind of trying to figure out who I am and how I came to be how I am. And the book forced me to kind of engage with those ideas in ways, because part of it is like you're kind of living, and the book forces you to kind of step away from it and look at the whole thing as opposed to just doing the thing. And even that simple process of stepping out of, like the kind of the race and assessing like, oh gosh, I started from there and now I'm over there, and look at all this stuff that happened in between. That's all incredibly useful. And I think that kind of process will inevitably shape the way you think about yourself and will enable you to understand more about why you are the way you are. And so, I mean, I suppose maybe it's the kind of recommendation to people to kind of, even if it's not through a book, to kind of the exercise of stepping back and figuring out what has shaped you and how you've been impacted by that is so important.
Yes. Yeah. And yes, I totally agree with the recommendation. And so the recommendation is that even if you're not planning on publishing a book, it still helps to write a journal, to engage in this process of self-discovery, self-exploration of who you really are, coming to the roots and the core of you, your perspective, your story, and how it has shaped you. And that's incredibly helpful professionally.
Yeah.
Of course, personally. I think it's a healing process personally, in my view. But but then when we come with this healed person, it brings us presence and power. And it's not the kind of presence of power that people bow to and say, they worship you or anything like that. It's a power to be able to connect with people as human beings, right?
Absolutely.
And the other aspect of that, and I want to ask you about this, is has that shaped the way you understand other people? Because you understood yourself. How does that shape you understanding other people, their points of views, their story, their journey?
Yeah,
the people that you work with.
Really critical point of it. I mean, because I think, there's two things here. One is that when you're writing, that once again you are trying to create human beings on the page, right? That's part of what you're trying to do, and that means that you have to understand how people think and what their motivations are, and why they might respond to a situation one way as opposed to another way.
Right.
And that process requires a great deal of empathy. And it also requires assessing human beings without judgment. Like if you're judging the character as you write the character, but if you say, I want to create a fully dimensional, sort of three-dimensional being here, you have to try to understand, place yourself in their shoes and understand why it is they are the way they are. So there's that aspect of it that I think helps you it helps me, let me put it in first person, helps me as I lead, because I will always try to understand the full humanity of people and how it is they arrive where they are. And also the one thing I've learned in leadership, just to step aside for a little bit, is just how profound, this sounds, it'll sound like a cliche, but people are just really different, motivation to do their work. Some require more attention than others. There's some people who you say, do the thing, and they'll do the thing, and a week later, the thing is in your inbox. Or the other people who got to check in all the time, and, how are you doing, and do you need some help, and that sort of thing. Or they need more.
Right.
And I think it's fine as we're all different. This is also connected to being a parent. I've learned that kids are different. They have different requirements. They have different personalities. And so I think part of being a leader is enter any kind of space with this idea that everybody needs to be the same. Now, I know there's some people who might disagree with that. They might cite the military as an example of, a space where conformity is important. And that could be the case. But I think in kind of civilian spaces, that it's important to kind of understand, because you can also use these, you can take advantage of like people's kind of big personalities to be deployed ways, as throughout the course of your leadership, right? Like the person who requires a lot of attention,
right?
That can also be its own kind of advantage in a way. Like, as time passes, you can understand, well, this is a person who cares about details, who's on top of it. So this person gets a project that requires, somebody who needs to pay close attention to details. And you can sort of think about the personality as you're leading. The second part of it is, so as a result, I know better, perhaps I'll never fully know, but I know better why I respond to certain situations one way as opposed to another. That as a leader, I know I have a better understanding of my, because as a writer, I've had to do this deep analysis on myself because I wrote a book that's based on myself, that I am better at understanding what my faults are, what my pressure points are, what might make me happy or what might, and that's important as well, because being a leader requires a kind of ability to remain calm in stressful situations and to not be triggered so quickly by the things. Like, I need to go into work with a different, because people are looking to me, that I cannot be the kind of person who's just like responding, in an emotional way to everything that happens. And I think I'm
Right.
better able to do that because of the work that I've done on myself and the work that my book did on me before I was able to produce it.
Wow. That is quite fascinating. And now, I'll be honest with you, Tope, I don't know how you do it. It's like you leading 3 separate lives all at the same time. You have your IPS, directorship, you are a writer, and you have a family. And we're not even talking yet about your membership of the board and other activities that you're involved in. So what would be your advice to someone who is in the corporate world doing the leadership part that you're doing the directorship part, being on the board, busy people? But when you say, hey, you need to sit down and write and own yourself and own your story and do some journaling, and they say, I don't have the time for it, it's hard, it's difficult, I don't want to do it, I'll do it some other time. What would you say to someone like that? They're not writers, they probably don't want to be. By the way, I think everybody here does have a book in them. I do agree with that.
Yeah.
It's in some this is why I said the business philosopher within you. There is a business philosopher or a philosopher within us that is waiting to come out, and they want to eventually put something on the paper and share it with the world, but they're putting it off. They say, well, I don't have the time.
Yeah.
What would be a good starting point for someone like that?
I would say to this person that that I don't think that there's anything more enriching than understanding who you are as a person. There's so much in our life that says to us that you have to pay attention to everything else. You have to pay attention to what the kinds of things you need to do at work, or what your other or your parents in general need, or what your kids need, if you commit some time every day to saying, gosh, what do I need? Why am I responding to this situation the way I am? I don't know.
Sure.
Why am I getting triggered, or why am I angered by this? Why am I happy about this?
Right.
And you sit down for 10, 15 minutes and process that. Try to process that by journaling or by some other method, praying or whatever works best for you. That you emerge from that process with a much better understanding of who you are. And what is life other than like trying? I mean, it's funny, like we all come into this world and you're growing up and you're being battered by this stimuli, and we have no control over where we are born or who our parents are. And you're trying to reckon with all of this. Like, I was born here, I'm this race, these are my parents, etc. And you just try to make a life for yourself based on these factors that you have no control. Even your personality, you have no. The thing I've learned as a parent is that you don't even have control of your personality. You come in kind of who you are. And so part of the mission of life has to be like figuring out who you are.
Yeah.
And there are so many people who don't know who they are. They just assume one guy's after another, or they say, in this situation, I'm this person, but in that situation, I'm that person. I think that all of us will be much better humans and much better at communicating with each other, and perhaps most importantly, much better at understanding each other if we did the hard work of understanding ourselves. And I don't know why there isn't and there used to be traditions that emphasize this in all cultures. It's part of what people like Campbell talk about. And that for whatever reason, modernity this kind of modern life that we live has determined that isn't important, that it's more important to kind of, be good at school or then go off and get habits and a piece of it, which is like, gosh, who is this person who's getting married? Who is this person who's doing this job? Who's this person who's trying to figure out life? It is maybe the most important thing you can do. And writing is one powerful way to achieve that.
Yes. Yeah. I agree 100%. I think it is the most important thing that we can do. Absolutely. And in this lifetime, because we only have 100 at most.
At most, yeah.
At most, right?
That clarifies. I tell myself,
clarifies.
I get one life. I mean, I get
Right.
one life. There's so much that I want to do, so much that I want to experience. And I think if you kind of fixate on that a little bit, not in a kind of obsessive way, but think, gosh, I get one
Right.
life, one opportunity to kind of make an impact. What am I going to
Sure.
do?
Right.
That can help to drive you a little bit. It certainly drives me.
Right.
Like
Right.
I
Yeah,
want to get as
absolutely.
much out of it as I can, before I
Yeah.
pull off the smoke coil, so.
It's sure. Yeah. So this is a fascinating conversation. I mean, all of what you've accomplished and your story, and I'm still reading your story and reading the story of Tunde, and I'm getting to know you through that agent.
Yeah,
So
sure.
I am honored to be having this conversation with you. I think it's the first time ever that I'm reading a book by an author, and even as I'm reading that book by this author, I'm actually having a conversation, a meaningful conversation, not just running into him or at a party.
Yeah.
I'm having a meaningful conversation about him as an author, his journey, and the content of his book. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate you. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation. If there is someone who wants to connect with you and get in touch with you and communicate with you in some way, what would be the best way for them to reach out?
Yeah, sure. So I have a website. It's topefolarin.com, TOPEFOLARIN.com. And all my information's on there, how to reach me on Twitter or Instagram or Facebook. And my email address is also there, which is tope@topefolarin.com. So
Sure.
I'm pretty easy to reach, and that's the best way to do it.
We'll put all that information in our show notes. We'll also put your book and some of the things that we talked about. We actually referenced quite a few number of works, and we'll put all of that on our show notes for our listeners to access. And so once again, thank you. And I look forward to keeping in touch with you.
Likewise, I look forward to many more conversations.